Hey guys, I hope you all are doing great and staying safe. I'm Karthikeya, Head of Digital Marketing at e-GMAT, and I'll be your host for today. So before we begin, can I know whether you guys can hear me clearly? A simple yes in the chat section will be enough. So you can just simply type yes in the live chat section and can you guys hear me? Cool. So, hello everyone. Welcome to the third session of our Real Success series, where we are trying to highlight the not so talked about struggles of our achievers and common misconceptions that GMAT test takers and MBA applicants tend to have. Now, with that, let me introduce the guest for today's session, Anupama. Hey, Anupama.
Hi Karthikeya. Hello everyone.
So Anupama is an e-GMATer who scored a 750 on the GMAT and has received an admit from Harvard with a need-based scholarship worth $136,000. Now, we will touch upon all the aspects, starting from GMAT preparation to MBA application and scholarships. But today's session will be a bit different because we'll be busting myths across each of these aspects. So with that, Anupama, why don't you give a brief introduction about yourself?
Thank you, Karthikeya. First of all, I'd like to thank every one of you who's joined. I hope this session helps you all. A brief introduction about me. I am Anupama. I graduated from NIT Warangal in chemical engineering in 2015. I have around 7 years of work ex. And immediately after my undergrad, I joined ITC, which is a CPG firm in India. I have worked across different roles of operations. I started with manufacturing, moved on to projects, and finally supply chain. After that, I took a slight change and I moved to marketing within ITC itself. I spent around 5 years working for chocolates and biscuits division there, and then I moved to Zomato. Been working there for the last 2 years in the digital marketing space. So that pretty much sums up my 7 years of work experience. And now I'll be joining HPS this year in the fall.
That's great. And once again, thank you so much for joining us. So, quickly, let's start with the first aspect, which is your approach towards GMAT preparation. So, you had an ideal approach towards your GMAT prep, which not a lot of students have. So, can you explain to us what that approach was and why did that approach work for you?
I believe that for me it was very different. I wouldn't be able to comment on the ideal part of it, but I spent around 80% of my time doing untimed practice. I did not solve a lot of questions. So my entire GMAT prep took around 4 months. And I spent the first 2.5 months only getting my concepts done, concept straight. And then I spent the next month or so doing untimed practice where I would spend, say, 2 hours over three questions. That's it. That was pretty much my practice, so to speak. And then the last 15-20 days is when I did timed practice, getting the mock strategies, getting the timing strategies, etc. But that's pretty much how my approach to GMAT preparation was.
So basically, you spent like 2 to 3 hours just trying to understand every aspect of a question. Now, what usually
Yes.
happens is now this is a common approach or belief in the GMAT space where GMAT test takers usually buy a book or subscription and they start blindly practicing till the point that they are getting most of the questions right. Like that's their metric that hey, I'm ready for the GMAT. So,
Right.
can you explain why you prepared the way you did? So, when I said it's ideal because you focused a lot on focusing on the concepts. So, why did you
Right.
prepare the way you did? Or was there something that triggered you to prepare that way?
Um, yeah, so I think I started off pretty much the way everybody does, right? I got my concept straight and I started solving questions from official guide. And up until 700, 720 level questions, I was fairly fine. I was getting them right. And then suddenly I observed that a string of questions were going wrong, post 700, post 720 level questions, like 7 questions wrong in a go. And I was like, what's happening? So that's when I realized that something in my core or something in my very base fundamental is not right. And it wasn't just about the concepts. That is when I started going very deep into analysis. I started dissecting both right questions as well as wrong questions. I started dissecting every option. I analyzed why I got an answer right. I analyzed why I got an answer wrong, both ways. So that is why I spent a lot of time unlearning a lot of biases and traps that you fall into generally. So that was my goal. I was like, I'm going to spend a lot of time, even if it is just 3 questions. I'm going to like know the in and out of why I got something right or wrong. That was pretty
So,
much the objective.
so that sounds pretty good. So can you explain a little bit? Like, can you share what kind of analysis you did in those 2 to 3 hours? Because it's like if you solve just 3 questions in a span of 2 to 3 hours, that sounds a lot. So what kind of analysis did you do?
One of the things I did was I picked up a sample of 20 questions, 20 wrong questions, let's say. And what I observed was more often than not, the choices that I would have selected would be D or E, out of the 5 options. That's when I realized that for my own self, what was happening was if I do not feel that one of the first 3 options are right, then invariably I would select the last two. Even though deep down I knew that D or E doesn't make a lot of sense. This analysis helped me to kind of realize what were the kind of traps I was falling into. Because the kind of traps I will fall into will be very different from somebody else. The reason why I get a question wrong will be very different from, say, why you get a question wrong, right? So, what I did was analyze the why, basically. So, that's when it helped. And how I approached it the next time was, even if it took some time, I would go back to option A or B, read it again 5 times, and see whether I'm completely confident that this is not an option, and then select D or E. So things like these. I kind of analyzed, the other type of analysis I did was more often than not in 750 level questions. It was just one word that I was losing out an answer from, right? And I
Okay.
observed that 30 to 40% of my wrong questions were only because of that one word, that I didn't read it. I conveniently ignored it in my head. So, what I went back to do the next time I solved is, even if it took 30 minutes per question, I read every single word, like forced myself to read every single word, even if it felt obvious. Now, you may ask me that, you don't have the liberty to do this in the real exam. That's right.
Hmm.
But when you put a habit to read every single word, take 30 minutes, it becomes subconsciously automatic for you in the exam. You don't miss out any word. That's pretty much what helped me by taking an enormous amount of time to solve and analyze questions. Hope that helps.
And yeah, it does definitely help. And, that's exactly why I called it ideal. So, what you actually did was that you spent the first 80% of the time on just building concepts. You weren't concerned with getting question right within a minute or two, or you weren't concerned with solving a ton of questions in a limited span of time. But what you actually focused on was building ability, which actually is the key if you want to get a score of 750 or more. So 750 and 760 plus scores like that, they require you to be, masters of topic. So that requires you to build ability. So I think that is what you actually did. And I think the 750 speaks for itself. So I'll just quickly take a minute, basically. So we are on the topic of GMAT. So I want to take a minute to talk about our next session with Hitesh. So Hitesh is an entrepreneur of a well-funded startup who has got an admit from UC Berkeley Haas. And basically he faced a very similar problem, right? That he was not studying the right way. And because of that, he kind of missed out on, I would say his GMAT score was not up to his expectation. But once he changed his approach, he got a 140 point score improvement, which is huge. And that also helped him get into UC Berkeley Haas. So you'll get the link in the chat section. Do register for it. And we'll discuss the GMAT and the MBA aspect of it. next week. So do register for it. So with that, Anupama, let's talk about your background. So I'll add some
Sure.
context. So Anupama, while we were discussing the theme for this session, you told me that you reached out to your friends and you reached out to several MBA consultants, and you were outrightly told that your profile is unconventional, and maybe you're not a fit for Harvard. So can you explain to the audience why did they say that your profile is unconventional?
Sure. Many applicants here would also agree with me when I say this, that there are certain myths that exist today in the atmosphere around the entire application process for top B schools and more so for Harvard. One of the biggest one was that if you are an engineer and not from an IIT in India, then that is not going to work very well in your favor. Then the chances that you get into Harvard are very low. And what a lot of consultants do then is they don't even encourage you to apply. And I know so many friends of mine who don't apply because of these myths. I applied in round two, and it's generally frowned upon to apply to Harvard in round two. People say that you shouldn't just go and apply in R1. Certain other concepts, certain other points about my background. I have a 6 month work gap in my profile. I did not work for 6 months in 2020 when I was switching roles between ITC and Zomato. I was unemployed for 6 months. I did not do anything. Um,
Wow.
yeah, and also I come with a 7 years work experience. If you see the average work experience for a lot of the M7B schools, you will see that it falls somewhere between 4 and 5. So that was also another myth that with such high work experience, maybe your profile doesn't look very attractive to the adcom. That was another myth. So these were the factors that made my profile unconventional, to answer your question.
Yeah, I mean, if it were any other applicant, usually he or she would have taken the feedback that you received and would have chosen to apply for some other B school. But even then, you decided to go against the feedback and apply to Harvard. So, can you just share what was your thought? So, what I want to basically communicate to the audience is, were you demotivated? And what was your thought process from that point where you were demotivated to the point that you went and applied to Harvard? Because I'm sure that would have been a huge struggle for you.
Yes, I mean, I would in fact like to first put it out there that I was devastated, hearing comments from experts in the industry that you may not be a fit for this, you should not apply for it, why don't you try for other schools, was very demotivating. I was very sad for, I think, a couple of weeks. I was like, okay, I don't think this entire process is for me. I don't think I'm going to get into any B school for that matter, forget Howard. And I think what helped me is my academic and professional journeys have had a lot of such myths in my life. And what helped me overcome this was how I have tackled those myths and how those have served as examples for me. For example, when I was in NIT Warangal, ITC was my dream company, right? And this myth was predominantly existent in the air that if you don't have a grade point above 9, then ITC won't recruit you, because statistically majority of the people who get into ITC, or rather all of the people who had gotten in the last few years, had a greater than 9 GPA. So I was like, okay, I was like, let me give it a try. So I prepared for it, I worked hard for it, and that year I was the only 8 pointer to get recruited by ITC. um, when I was in ITC, I really wanted to do marketing, like I said. And my HR, my peers, my seniors, everybody told me that if you do not have an MBA degree, you cannot get into marketing. And it took me 6 months, 11 rejections. I would just pitch myself for different openings. I would approach senior management. I was like, I'm really keen to do this. Give me a chance. And I did get into marketing eventually. So I wouldn't say that every myth you can, just overcome. But my life has taught me that if there is a myth, you give it a try and you try to overcome it. And the biggest learning that I've had is, if it is not written down somewhere, then it is not necessarily true. There is nowhere in Howard's website or their pages where they write, if you have a 7 years of work ex, you will not get in. It's nowhere written that if you apply in R2 you will not get in. you know so as long as it's not written, i I was just not going to accept it. So yeah, that's what pretty much motivated me. My life journeys have taught me that the myths have to be treated as myths.
Perfect. And that was a great line. If it's not written, it's not true. I think that's a feedback or a takeaway that everyone can take away, because I've seen that a lot of candidates with the kind of feedback that you received, they tend to self-reject themselves. And I've heard again and again, a lot of people who got into top B schools, they say the very first point they say is that do not self-reject yourself. There is something
Right.
that you can offer and you should definitely try. So
Absolutely.
what you said made sense. It's very inspirational, to be honest, and I'm glad you went against the feedback. So you did that, and now let's talk about the interesting part, which got you into Harvard, which is MBSAs. So
Sure.
just to set context, you know, so whenever you are tackling MBSAs, it takes around 4 to 5 iterations usually for MBA applicants to get their essays right. But for
Right.
Anupama, it took 14 iterations. So, Anupama, what was your primary challenge that caused you to rework on your essays so many times?
uh, Thank you for that question. Well, I think I made a couple of mistakes along the way, and this is a learning for everyone who's listening to this today. One of the biggest mistakes I made when I approached my HBS essay was I read a lot of sample essays by current and past students. And what that did to me is I got biased and I started writing my own essay in the way that is popular or in the way that generally works, because there are only a few themes that people generally talk about, and I started copying them subconsciously. And I realized very later on in my process that none of these essays feel like me. They didn't, when I read them, it didn't feel like I was reading about myself. I was just reading about something that sells. So that was one. The second reason why I think I had so many iterations was because in my 7 years of work experience, I've had many stories that would feel tempting for me to add in the essay, right? And one of the biggest challenges I faced was I wanted to add all these beautiful, attractive accomplishment stories. Yeah, I wanted to add something I did in ITC, something I did in Zomato, something I did in my college. And that's why it took me so many iterations, because what I realized eventually is that you should be able to let go of the need to add everything about yourself. And you shouldn't add a story just because it looks beautiful, just because it seems like a big accomplishment. You should add it because it fits in with you, it fits in with your theme that you are writing about in your Howard essay, right? You would have chosen a theme, you write about it, that story should align with it. It shouldn't feel out of place. If somebody is reading that, it shouldn't feel like, okay, this candidate has written this story for the heck of writing it, just for telling me that, look, hey, I made a big accomplishment in my life, read about it. So I think that's why it took me so many iterations. And on the 14th iteration, when I read my HBS essay, in that instant I was like, "Yeah, this is me." In fact, Howard asks you to write a post interview reflection note where it asks you to tell them about the entire application process and how you felt. And I have actually written in that there is no document other than my HBS essay that describes who I am better. It just summarizes it to the point. So I think being authentic and being yourself is very underrated, but at least that's what helped me immensely in my HBS essay.
So that sounds great. And I have a follow-up question. So even in the introduction phase, you talked about that you faced mental health issues and you took a 6 month sabbatical in your professional career. And just now you said that you need to be authentic and vulnerable, and this was one of your learnings. So was this the reason why you opened up about your personal challenges? And the reason why I ask is that people usually avoid writing about their personal challenges because, I mean, yes, you talked about it, but like, was this the reason that made you talk about it in your essays?
um yes, actually, if you go about and see what B schools themselves urge you to talk about, they urge you to be vulnerable, they urge you to be honest and authentic. But what I would like to point out at the same time is we shouldn't be vulnerable for the heck of being vulnerable. Okay, I will share something that's a big struggle story about my life. It's going to gain me brownie points. It shouldn't be put out in the essay for that reason. It should be put out because it fits with your theme that you're writing, it fits with who you are. That's one point, that definitely be vulnerable, don't be worried. I wrote about my journeys with mental health. I did battle depression, I had anxiety disorders. I wrote about it out right in my HBS essay. I wrote about my 6 month work gap. I wrote about why I did it. The only thing to keep in mind would be, and what worked for me, is not just write about the struggle, but how you overcame it. Because then that is what tells the admissions committee or the reader that, okay, the person went through a big struggle and this is how the person overcame it. So I think those are the two most important points that work for me. To be vulnerable with a reason, as long as it aligns with your theme, and more importantly, just show them what you did. How did you overcome that struggle?
Yeah, so in a span of two questions, I think we covered a lot. So let's summarize this, but in an interesting way. So let's say if you were to tackle your Harvard application again, what would you do different? Like how would you go
um,
about it now?
I would definitely not read sample essays until I have written, say, 5 or 6 iterations. I would just not read anything. I would just like start blank, you know. That's one. Secondly, I think I would definitely look at every story of mine with a very critical eye as to whether it deserves to be in my Harvard essay or not, irrespective of whether it is a beautiful story or not. Yeah, I think those would be the two biggest ones, and definitely be vulnerable. I wish I was more vulnerable in my very first few iterations. Maybe that would have cut down my number of iterations.
Definitely. So let's talk about one topic that people usually ask, people who have a similar amount of experience that you have. So you have 7 years of work ex, and you might have worked with several managers in this period. So how did you go about selecting a recommender for your LOR?
Sure. So I had 7 years of work experience. So I had worked with around four supervisors. The
Hmm.
one thing that Howard asks you to do is choose one recommender who's your current supervisor. That is
Hmm.
most preferred. So that is what I did. One of them was my current supervisor. And the second would be I chose someone who supervised me for the longest period of time and also during the period that showcased most of my growth, most of my accomplishments, right? Because generally what helps is that they validate your stories, they validate your resume, right? So that is how I went about choosing the other recommender, because one is straightforward, you just choose your current supervisor.
Cool. So with that, I think now let's move on to Howard interview experience. And just so that everyone is aware, Harvard's interview process is probably the most unique experience. And the reason for that is because the Harvard interview is, I think, around 30-minute rapid fire interview. It includes around
Yes.
20 to 30 questions, which means you have around 60 to 90 seconds to answer. And the best part is you do not get time to think. So you just have to think and you have to answer it in the span of 60 to 90 seconds. So Anupama, why do you think, or what do you think Harvard is evaluating a candidate on through this process?
So what I could say is, basis the research that I did before my interview preparation, speaking to a lot of current and past students, what I realized, and a lot of consultants as well, what I realized is HBS wants to see whether you will be a good fit into their case study based method, right? In their case study classroom, right? And what they're trying to do is replicate that atmosphere in this 30-minute interview. which is why they will ask you anywhere between 20 to 30 questions within a span of 30 minutes. You do not have time to think. You don't say, okay, can I take a minute to think? It's just like a rapid fire. Questions keep coming onto you one after the other. They may not be connected to the previous question. Something could be from your college days, something could be from 2 days ago. So it's literally that, and what they try to see is, can you fit into their classroom? Because in HBS classroom there is a concept called cold calling, where they will randomly pick up any person in the classroom and ask them their opinion about the case, or ask them their opinion about the question. Yeah. So that is pretty much why I believe in, from my own research, why HBS conducts interviews the way it does. And of course, also that, when you are getting questions, this is my personal belief, when you're getting questions thrown at you every minute, you don't have time to think and lie. You don't have time to concoct some story up, and that is my personal takeaway from my own interview experience, that you just can't lie in an HBS interview. It's very difficult to lie in an HBS interview.
So I think let's, for the sake, so that the audience knows, do you remember some of the questions, which you thought were interesting or challenging that you can share with us right now? So do you remember any of those questions?
Sure. So majority of my interview was around my professional experiences. So I was asked larger level questions, not very specific. For example, why did ITC launch chocolates? Why did it decide to go into the chocolate space? Or how has COVID 19 impacted the food delivery industry in India? I was asked to give an overview and a lay of the land about the food tech space in India. How does it work? What are the industry like? What are the companies that operate? I was also asked certain specific questions like, why do you think Swiggy's valuation is higher than Zomato's, for example? So, largely professional, but very high level overview questions.
Hmm. So how did you prepare for them? Because what was the strategy, initial strategy? I'm sure you prepared for your interview before going into the interview. So what was your approach for the interviews? How did you prepare for them?
So my initial approach was, in one word, terrible. You know,
Okay.
I would give answers as long as 3 minutes. They were too technical, because
Hmm.
in my head it was like, I need to give one right answer, one perfect answer to the
Hmm.
question. So I was researching up upon industries. I was reading up The Economist. I was like getting my facts straight, and I was delivering the answers in a very technical fashion. Like a Q&A, and they were, to be honest, very boring answers.
So
And yeah,
I'm
sorry.
so sorry to interrupt. So basically, till now I understand the boring piece to it, but I see that, even from my perspective, if you are factually wrong or if you are correct, how is that bad? And if it's bad, can you explain to me why is that bad? And how did you change that? Like, how did you change your final approach?
So I think why it is bad, I wouldn't necessarily categorize it as bad, but why it wasn't helpful, or
Helpful, yeah.
why I heard consultants tell me that this is not what the committee is looking for, is, imagine you're in a class of 900 students, and what they're looking for is, can you explain a concept that is completely unknown to someone else in a manner that is interesting and informative? So they're not looking for you to give a PDF version or a technical version of an answer. What they are actually looking for is whether you can explain it to a layman and be concise. These were the three biggest things that I learned during my interview preparation. Can you be concise? Can you answer in less than a minute? Can you keep it conversational and not as a Q&A? And lastly, can you make it informative and interesting? So the other person is really interested to learn about it. So that is what my learning was. And I'll give an example as to how I would answer a question before and then how it changed. So, for example, the question she asked me around how has COVID-19 impacted food tech. Earlier, my approach would be to say, hey, so the revenues have gone up by X percent, the order values have gone down by Y%, and this is what's happened. And later on, my answer looked something like this, was what the actual answer I gave in the interview was. So basically, after COVID, the one thing that has majorly changed is the amount of food that is ordered in one order has increased because more family members have started to consume food now after COVID.
Agreed.
And I
Yeah.
gave a personal example that the best way to look at it is my father never ate outside food earlier. But now when I order, I also order from him via Zomato and Swiggy. So that is how I realized and I changed my approach.
I mean, that's a great example and actually makes sense why, the first aspect. Now, I could not see then when you were explaining why, because technically right is right, in my opinion. But obviously, like if you are doing an MBA, you need to make things very interesting. And the example you gave was a perfect example. So, I'm going to take a quick detour. So, by the way, guys, we have two more questions, and you can ask your questions so that Anupama can take them up during the Q&A. So, yeah, so go ahead, ask your questions. So, Anupama, I want to basically ask a question with respect to, MBA consultant. So, you took advice from many consultants, and so did you go for a consultant or while you were applying for HBS?
Yes, I did. I went with Nupur, who's from Crack the MBA, and
Yes.
at least for me, it worked immensely. And I don't say this because I've already gone through someone and I've gotten through HBS, but let me tell you why it helped me and worked in my case. The point I mentioned about adding stories, right? And adding stories that sound and look very tempting. What my consultant helped me with, and what was one of her biggest value add, was to help me differentiate from stories that mattered with my theme and stories that were just fancy and looked good. So that was one of the biggest value adds. The second was maintaining a consistency. If I've added two stories, do they even make sense together in my essay? And the other thing which I felt was very useful for me was when you write an essay, you're very tempted to write what you felt, what you wanted to do, what you thought. And that's very good because they do want to know about your motivations, they do want to know what you felt, but it should always be attached to an action that you took. It should also be attached to, okay, so you felt this, but what did you do after this? And that's where my consultant helped me redirect myself to actions. Okay, this is your motivation. What did you do? What was the outcome? So I think that's where these were certain value adds that definitely helped me after onboarding a consultant. And I think throughout the process, it's important to have an outsider perspective who asks you the right questions. So if I was writing a story about leadership,
Hmm.
she used to really critique me and say, how is this leadership? This is not
Hmm.
leadership. You may think it's leadership because you were leading a team of 10, but you have not shown any action that shows leadership.
Hmm.
And this kind of critiquing really helped me refine my stories, choose my stories, and eventually put them in the essay.
Yeah, and you definitely got an admit from Harvard. And so before we go for the Q&A, so you received $136,000 in scholarship, which is a need-based form of scholarship. So can you elaborate what a need-based scholarship and how does, like, what are some of the criteria that Harvard looks for while rewarding a need-based scholarship?
Sure. Let me just give a big disclaimer. There is no merit involved in this scholarship. It's got nothing to do with a candidate's profile or how great their candidacy is. This is a scholarship that's awarded by Harvard after you get an admit, and it is completely dependent on two factors and two factors only. One is your income, and one's your savings. That's it. It does not matter how many years of work experience you have, it doesn't matter how amazing your profile is. It is not a merit based scholarship, it's need based. So they have an internal formula that they calculate your need based scholarship via. They take in your income for the last 3 years. They take in your savings for the last 3 years. They take your economic background in consideration, and they give you a scholarship. So generally, for Indians who have an annual income less than $50,000, do get a scholarship, say 40 to 50%.
Okay. So yeah, with that, I think we are done with our list of questions, and now we'll go to the Q&A. So I can see a
Sure.
lot of people, getting inspired by your story. So let's start with, I'm not sure if you know this guy, but he's from ITC. So he's basically a
Oh
chef
wow.
who has 8 years of experience, and he's taking the GMAT on the 27th. So
Okay.
he's asking about how good are his prospects.
All right. So, hello, RB. Great to see your fellow ITCN and all the best for your GMAT. As for how good are your prospects, one thing that I would really urge you to do if you haven't done this already is that there are many consultants out there who do profile basis your scores, your CVs, and your work experience, and tell you what are your chances of getting into specific schools. Right? They do this. I would, of course, tell you to take those evaluations with a pinch of salt. But unfortunately, I'm not in a place where I can tell you how good or bad they are. But reading this, I definitely don't think there is anything that should prevent you from applying and going for it. So please do so. Don't stop yourself from applying, because as long as it's not written anywhere, it's not true. So yeah, all the very best.
Yeah, I think that will become the theme of this session. I just saw someone that it needs to be a t-shirt quote. So I think let's take a question for GMAT, and it's pretty interesting because I don't think we talked about it. So basically,
Okay.
so I'm sure he's asking about himself, but I think I'll switch it to your own, like about your GMAT preparation. So did you study quant and verbal parallelly, or did you prepare quant or verbal first and then the second section later on?
I think here, this was my personal journey. I always found the quant part easier
Hmm.
than the verbal, as many uh, people applying from India would, many engineers would. But that being said,
Hmm.
initially, I would urge you to do a quick check on how you're placed with quant and verbal. I wouldn't urge you to take a mock, maybe, but just like solve a few questions and see how comfortable you are. If you feel that you need a lot of scope in quant, then I would urge you to do that in parallel as well. But I did not. I did that in the last 20 days. My majority of preparation was focused on verbal, and only the last 15 days were quant.
Yeah, so that makes sense. And I think I'll add something which echoes something similar to what you said. So before you start your preparation, it is very important that you know where you are lacking. So if you are, let's say, an engineer, and if you are not weak in quant, if you are already on a Q47, Q48, then maybe you don't need to do it parallel. You can start with verbal and then cover quant parallelly. So I think I'll basically, you will see a free Sigma X mock link in the comments. You can take that and you will be able to assess your starting ability based on that. So you'll find the link in the comments.
Got it.
Okay. So let's take a gap related question that I saw. So basically, I think a lot of people here have a very similar experience where they have a gap year. So how would you justify that? I know that you cannot tell them how would they go about doing it, but how did you go
Sure.
about doing it? Maybe they can take away something from that.
Thanks for the question, Lavanya. I had a 6 month sabbatical, and the reason why I had it was I wanted to take care of my mental health. I had been working nonstop for a very long period of time after I lost my mom. So that was very clear in my head that I want to take a break. Secondly, I also wanted to change my work stream from, say, the marketing to something similar. So I left ITC and I started looking out for it. So my suggestion would be that if you're honest about the reasons behind your gap period, and you show how what you did after your gap period and how your gap period probably helped you to reach there. I think that could be really useful. That's what worked for me because I was honest and I told them how those 6 months helped me in wherever I am today. But if you have any personal reasons, then yeah, maybe go for it.
Yeah, that's great. And I
It
have
would
one
be
more. Yeah,
sorry to
go ahead.
interrupt you, Kartike, but it would be a little more difficult for me to comment on the nature of your gap period. But I think what, again, just to reiterate, what helped me is to clearly outline why it was the way it was and what it did for me. So yeah.
Yeah, so I have a very similar gap related question. Now, this time, it tackles something of that belief aspect that you talked about, that people have that, belief that they should not talk about it. So I think this question perfectly covers that. So can you just cover the aspect that is it negative to reveal a gap that big? So this Aditya has a gap of 3 years, and he has a pretty justified reason. He was preparing for UPSC and now wants to go for an MBA. So will it be taken negatively if he reveals that?
Um, I wouldn't be able to comment on this exact situation, whether it would be construed negatively or positively, for example. But I'm pretty sure when you apply, you cannot hide this, right? Practically speaking, it will show somewhere in your CV, somewhere in your resume that you do have a 3 years of work experience gap, right? What could probably help you is to outline how those 3 years changed you, either to reach where you are today or to help you decide what you really want to do in your life or anything. So I think, again, to reiterate, what helped me in my situation was to tell them that this is what I did in those 6 months. And honestly, I didn't do a lot in those 6 months. I didn't create a startup, or I didn't do part time or freelance work. No, I didn't do much. But I was honest and I told them that this is what it helped me do. So maybe work on showing it in a way that would showcase the real you for them. That could be the best advice I have for you. So yeah, hope that helps.
So let's again go back to GMAT, and we didn't talk about your IR and AWA preparation. So, I mean, so how much time did you spend on your IR and AWA, and when did you start with your IR and AWA preparation?
I'm sorry for laughing, but my AWA score was zero. There was a technical glitch in my GMAT. I gave my exam from home, and I had a zero. And I wrote to the school saying that there was a technical glitch, and because of AWA, I do not want to retake the exam. And they just accepted it. A lot of places I have read that IR and AWA do not matter as much. My IR score was four, I guess, if I'm
Hmm.
not mistaken. So that just tells you that I did not devote time for these two sections
Time to
at
IR and
all.
AWA.
I did not. Like, it would be an exaggeration if I tell you I devoted a week. I did not devote any time. So I don't know how much of that you should follow, but I did not do it. And in my opinion, hopefully it doesn't matter a lot.
It does matter. So I'll add some context to it. So basically, INSEAD looks for your IR AWA
No,
score.
no, I just
It
meant for HBS. I'm
Okay.
sorry. I'm
Yeah.
not speaking for other schools.
So in general, basically, so because HBS has a need-based scholarship, maybe not then, but INSEAD, it gives away, like, it's very, I would say, strict when it comes to scholarship, and it considers your IR score definitely, and some of the consulting firms, they also consider your IR score because it's very quant heavy, so they do consider that. Now there is one more interesting question, and this is basically, how did you manage your GMAT preparation while having a full-time job? And one more thing, just to add context. So Anupama here has a very accomplished career. Like, she was probably the only, I would say, non-MBA individual in ITC who worked in marketing. And also I would say, she joined Zomato and made a huge impact. So it didn't like, so how did you do all of this, like have an accomplished career and then excel on the GMAT?
I think for me, it was a really slow and very slow and a very steady race. If I were to say, I couldn't put in more than 3 hours a day for my GMAT preparation, 2 to 3 hours at max. So I think for me, it was like I said, it was never about solving a lot of questions. I hardly solved, I was barely able to complete the OG. So that was only the number of questions I had solved. So I think for me, it was slowly and very gradually building up concepts that helped me. So it took me 4 to 5 months, but I did it very slowly. And yeah, there is no quick fix for it. And there are already a lot of stories online that tell you about consistency and everything. I just think what helped me was going really slow and strengthening my concepts. Because once my concepts were strengthened, once I knew what are the tricks and traps I tend to fall in, it was much easier for me to maintain consistency in my mocks. I would consistently get a 750 or 760 in my mocks. That was mainly because I knew the kind of traps GMAT deploys and the kind of traps that I fall into. So, yeah.
Cool. So
And
let's talk.
also, just a
Yeah,
small point before
yeah.
that, I did take a 10-day gap just before my GMAT exam, and for me personally, I feel that that was very important. I didn't do anything, and more importantly, it's because it clears your head of other commitments, whether it is work, whether it is personal stuff. You just do GMAT and GMAT for those 10 days, nothing else. So yeah.
Cool. And yeah, that makes sense. So there is one question regarding, fear and anxiety, which is a very common topic when it comes to, a time test such as GMAT. So I think, so basically, Rini faced something, basically the time and fear anxiety issue. So did you face something like this? And if yes, so because the thing is that you only spend 80% of your time focusing on concepts, right? So your test readiness kind of was included in that. So did you ever face a challenge like when it came to solving a question within the stipulated time?
See, I think again, I would again go back to, I think this is what people tend to generally overlook the importance of the concept. That, once your subconscious has the concepts built in, the time really doesn't matter that much. You can solve it within a minute because your subconscious is trained. But answering Reni's question around, she says, I get questions wrong even when I know how to crack them. This happened with me. And what I did to tackle this was, beyond the point, I realized that it's an emotional game more than an IQ game, which is, I think, what she's also experiencing. So I would design mocks where I would deliberately put RC passages at the end. I would put a very difficult question at the beginning, because these are the things that tend to demotivate you during the exam. These are the things that pull your morale down, and even if you know how to crack a question, you just cannot crack it. So I did these things that kind of helped me build my emotional so-called resistance.
Okay, so let's go back to I think this is mostly application related. So how were your extracurriculars? Like people usually say that you need to have excellent extracurriculars. So did you have that? And if not, or if, then what do you think is the weightage of that?
I do think they're very important. Uh, this is what I've heard from, and I wouldn't say that this is a myth, because, and I'll tell you why I say this, because there are specific questions designed in the application asking you about your extracurriculars, right? There are specific questions, like, for example, if I were to pick the example of Stanford, there's an entire section that asks you about extracurriculars. In your CV, there is an entire section beneath that you speak about your extracurriculars, right? So, my extracurriculars, just to give you an insight, I've been very actively involved in animal welfare. I volunteer with an NGO called Bangalore Cat Squad. I've been active in the mental health space, just causes that are very personal to me, and that I'm very passionate about. So I wouldn't say that you need to have excellent extracurriculars. I don't know if that's necessary, but I do believe that they're important in my personal experience, in my opinion, and after speaking to a lot of people.
No, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. So I think let's talk about B school decisions. So what is a good strategy, basically, uh, or basically you take the GMAT and then decide B school, or you have a B school in mind and then take the GMAT? Like what did you do?
I had decided on schools that I want, and I had decided on a target GMAT score, and I knew that 750 or 760 is what I want, and I wanted to target the 3 or 4 schools. That's the approach I took. But if it helps, if you think that uh, your GMAT score may be, uh, may turn out in any which way, then you can approach it that way as well. But I think some amount of certainty around either the school that you want or the GMAT score that you want could really help you, in my opinion.
Cool. Now, there is one question related to being authentic. Now, Mahnoor, this is something she has answered in detail, but I think let's take this because I think it can add some value. So, can you take this up?
Sure. So there is a guide that Harvard releases every year. It's called the Harvard Guide, and it publishes around 100 essays of students, past students, current students. And what I've consistently observed in that is that each essay has a certain theme. Now that theme could be as simple as, "Hey, I am somebody who doesn't give up," and my entire life story is around that. That was my theme. I'm someone who perseveres. I'm someone who does not give up. Your theme could also be something like, I am the one who decides what I want. I'm the master of my own fate. Your theme could be anything, right? That being said, it's not absolutely necessary to have a theme. I have seen essays in which people say, "Hey, in my entire life, I've had two major learnings, and these two major learnings have shaped me into who I am and have brought me to where I am today." You could approach the essay that way as well. It is not necessary to have a theme, but why maybe a theme helps is it helps you get clarity. Otherwise, you end up writing anything and everything in your essay. That's the tempting part, right, which I mentioned. So what helped me and what will help you is to introspect a lot. Go deep back, 10 years back, 15 years back, and think about everything that you have done. What was your motivating factor behind it? What is the one common theme that comes up again and again about your life? The best way to put it is, when you read your essay, it should feel like somebody is talking about Manur. You know, that's like you're reading about Manur. If you get that feeling, you know that, okay, you've written an essay that does justice to you. So, to answer your question on how did I get to the point of being authentic in my essay, I think I went more and more deeper into finding my theme, and then the stories just kept flowing. Hey, this story also fits into my theme. That story also fits into my theme. But you should choose what's unique to you and not what works or sells or what everyone else has written.
So I have a follow-on question. Now, this is because you were talking about theme, and that's something that people they do not talk about it, outrightly. Or I would say I have not heard about it the way you talked about it right now. So my question is basically, when you were designing theme, or saying you were setting theme for your essay that would define who Anupama is, what were your, I would say, don'ts? Like, what were the things that you were like, okay, this is something that I won't do at all, or that would compromise the quality of my essay? So are there some aspects that you would suggest the candidates to not like do?
I'll have to really think on this, but I think a complete don't would be something like I mentioned early on in my session today, that do not try to add a story that is like a big accomplishment or that will look very fancy. It doesn't fit in with your theme. And even bigger don't is, I just think that when you write something that you've absolutely not done, you know, like like glorifying your accomplishments to an extent is fine, but creating something that you've just not done is not going to help. It didn't help with me, because I did that in the beginning. I tried adding things, I tried writing things that I had absolutely not done. you know, and it didn't feel authentic. So, to also answer the question that was asked before that, I think how did I get to a point of being authentic is to let go of things that I cannot add. Excuse me.
So, I mean, you took 14 iterations, and I think it was a, I would say, pretty extensive, long journey for you. So, which round did you apply for? It was R2, right?
Yes.
So, people generally say that like R1 has the best chance if you want to get in. So, like, what were you feeling? Basically, when did you start applying for Harvard? And were you dead serious about R1, or were you like, I need to have a good application in place for R2?
I was dead serious about R1. I
Then what
was
happened?
dead serious because, like I said, I had heard that, you try
Yeah.
applying in R1, chances are better. Now, even though it's a myth, and even though I can say, but I had the time, so I was like, okay, I'm going to apply in R1. But my GMAT ended in July mid, and I had a month and a half to apply for R1. And believe me, when I came near the deadline, I realized that my essays were not up to the mark. I wasn't feeling confident about my essays. My consultant was not feeling confident about it. And more importantly, I realized that if I do submit these essays, they will not reflect, or I won't be confident about them in my interview. So honestly, I wanted to apply in R1, but what happened is my mental health took so much of a toll. I was so burnt out, I was so drained after the GMAT, that I told my consultant that it does not matter what happens, I'm just going to apply everything in R2. And she told me to apply to some schools in R1. I said I'm going to apply in R2. My advice would be, try applying as early as you can, right? Because I won't I wouldn't know what the chances are. You could go online and see the statistics of the percentage of candidates that get through in R1 and R2. It's available online. But if you apply as early as you can, you get more time to apply, because it's a process that requires introspection, it's a process that requires iteration. So the earlier you start, the chances of you getting to a better quality essay is higher. That is my suggestion. But if you feel by the R1 deadline that your essays are not up to the mark, my suggestion would be to not apply in R1. Because if you don't feel confident about your essay, the adcom will definitely not feel confident about your essay, in my opinion. So yeah, I applied to all the schools in R2, and yeah.
So basically, just like what everyone says, it doesn't matter if you are early if you're not ready. So you need to be ready. And if you're ready, then being early is definitely an advantage, but you need to be ready for sure.
Yes,
So with that, yep, go ahead.
I would
Go
never
ahead.
say go for R2 only, or go for,
Yeah.
I would say what generally people say, try as early as you can. Do not delay it. Don't just say, okay, R2 is also there, let me apply in R2. Try as early as you can, because also a logistics point of view is, I got my decision late in R2 and I'm running around doing my visa formalities. It will happen, but it's just
Yeah.
a little crunched for time. So yeah.
Yeah, so I see a lot of GMAT related and profile related questions. So, guys, I'll repeat that what Anupama suggested. Basically, if you have a profile related query, then an MBA consultant would be a more appropriate way to get your profile evaluated. As for GMAT, Anupama has already answered the questions in the initial part of the interview. You can view that. And if you have any more questions, then you can attend our upcoming session, which is with Hitesh, who is a UC Berkeley Haas MBA candidate, and he will talk about what are the 2 to 3 simple things that he did that helped him improve his GMAT score by more than 140 points. So you will get the registration link in the comments. And with that, Anupama, thank you so much for taking out the time to do this. And I can see from the comments and the engagement, people love this session, and
Thank you
it
so
was
much.
of immense value. And thank you so much for being
Thank
here.
you. I'm
And
glad
as
I
for
could help.
yeah, so I think the primary key takeaway from the session is, if it's not written, then don't believe it, or whatever we said. But it was the perfect summarization, the perfect line to end this session.
Thank you
So
so
as for
much.
everyone else, do register for the upcoming session. I'll see you next week, and thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you so much, guys. Hope it helped. Good night.